America's leading industry is still the manufacture, distribution, packaging, and marketing of bullshit.
With the government beholden to billionaires and real estate, or our vision for the future. We are done with empty promises wrapped up in flimsy packaging of dishonesty and corruption.
Feed the rich and feed the poor. This is class war.
You don't lose anything by losing faith, okay? What you gain is reality.
Hello there, welcome to Bullshit and Biases. I'm Miss Maserati on YouTube and on Substack, continuing a series on critical thinking, debate, identity, and what that all has to do with culture gone wild, and politics too. So there's some psychology, sociology, neuroscience, biology, and a lot of other science that goes into all these things that we can know that help us discern what is bullshit while better understanding human behavior. This is a mix of content that covers all these topics as they influence each other. I even do some media analysis if the story lends to the topic. Debate is a con game, the Ad Hominem, the oldest trick in the book to get out of an argument and shift the blame. I thought we should get some framework going, a little bit of a primer for understanding what's really happening in a debate or even a couple's disagreement. There might be a con artist, aka a manipulator, but can you spot them? That's what this series is about, and much more regarding the ways in which politicians, advertisers, scammers, and abusers trick people. None of these bad actors is coincidental. It's all about money, greed, and exploitation. Because of that, we can use a system of logic to see it. You've probably heard of it before. People call it critical thinking. An interesting thing about it is that very few people who profess to have it actually could prove it by catching biases in real time. This is something that you can see in a debate. However, because you have to be fast enough to catch it in the moment that it comes from their mouth, because what you're looking for are these things called logical fallacies and rhetorical devices. Rhetoric takes a larger view and looks at an overall style of an argument that a person uses, like a pattern, to be persuasive by trying to evoke emotions and actions, but doesn't focus on facts and logic. Logical fallacies are examples of how emotional arguments are rhetorical devices that can be used as errors in reasoning that make an argument invalid, often by using flawed logic or faulty assumptions. Fallacies can be used accidentally or deliberately to manipulate or persuade another person and can initially seem convincing, but could be disproven through logical analysis rather than just facts. And that's bullshit. From the abstract, bullshit can be harmful to your health. Bullshitting is characterized by sharing information with little to no regard for the truth, established knowledge, or genuine evidence. It involves the use of various rhetorical strategies to make one's statements sound knowledgeable, impressive, persuasive, influential, or confusing in order to aid bullshitters in explaining things in areas where their obligation to provide opinions exceed their actual knowledge in those domains. You've probably seen it happen before and even had the thought that this person isn't making sense, or that's a lie, or even this isn't fair. You may have just not known that there were names for these errors that the person just used to try to make an untrue idea sound true. Or maybe they even turned the conversation onto you and you suddenly found yourself defending some mistake that you made 2 years ago. In these moments, you know there's some manipulation going on. Logic is kind of like an equation in math, except it's for language. It's a set of rules that helps you govern what ideas have relevance or create a sound argument when you're thinking and processing whether an idea is correct or incorrect. But those same rules, when applied to conversations, would help you spot when someone is trying to manipulate you. Maybe not even on purpose. They are unaware that their own ideas are manipulation and they fell for it too. Now they're repeating it to you, believing it's fact or reality, and they're an unintentional con artist to get their way, or whatever it is they think they're entitled to. It's all about using your emotions and ideas against you. Emotional weapons. It seems like a strange idea, but that is scratching the surface of the powers of the human emotions and their control over our behaviors through biased and irrational ideas. This is actually the basis for anxiety in human beings. It's our emotions mixed up with unrealistic ideas that result in anxious decisions that don't make sense to people around the anxious person. Emotions are an explanation behind the irrational. It seems like such a basic premise, but it's often forgotten. Manipulations used during arguments, debates, and disagreements are often the result of someone trying to push a goal motivated by emotions. Sometimes people can be very unaware of how much their emotions are motivating the lines that are tumbling out of their mouths and producing ever more irrational behaviors and attempts to manipulate to force you to give up whatever they're attempting to persuade you out of. It's the only method that they know to get what they want, programmed there by parents who would selfishly train them with cognitive biases, making excuses or fallacious arguments to their own child until the child would go on to use the same devices and be selfish to others. The selfish goal may not be money, sex, or even valuable assets. They could merely be trying to con you into agreeing with them to soothe their feelings and feel validated in their opinions. It's their way of controlling you into being safe for them to be around. The head safe space that only individuals with privileged positions can occupy, which is emotional fragility. Emotional labor is only for those who don't have the power to demand it or the money to buy it. The world runs on identity and ego, concepts tied to individualism that so many of us are taught as the default. We were never really told that people think differently from how we were taught in the US, or at least I wasn't, because you feel you have an identity, so you assume it's there and that it's real, and because you're told free will is real and it feels like it is to you, well, what is there to question? It turns out, a lot. Neuroscience can make you question a lot about those ideas, but that's way too large of a subtopic for this post. You can expect more about it in the future, as it will help you understand some science of the emotions that underlie debates and arguments, specifically manipulation. Knowing how our brains can trip us up can help us find empathy and patience for ourselves and others. If we truly desire to be productive, get to a solution with somebody, we will find the discipline to follow the rules of logic and argumentation to show others how much we value their ideas, but also want to get to answers that make logical sense. It's all about putting the ego aside for a moment. But for manipulators, politicians, and advertisers to use your emotions to control you, one of the easiest ways to do this is to use your identity. Given that we live in a societal structure that devalues some identities, that means that some people's identities become targets for attacks on their credibility. It's part of a strategy. This subtle use of identity is seen in incidences of racism, sexism, classism, and all other forms. It is using the person's identity to silence criticism by undermining their credibility, even if they're making very valid logical points backed with evidence. This is seen in reactionism. You can check out my last post on reactionism in relationships to learn more about the power structures in our arguments. The ad hominem attack. What's interesting is that using identity to derail a topic is literally one of the oldest tricks in the debate book. It was called the ad hominem attack. It goes all the way back to around 322 BC when Aristotle was crafting his texts. In his work, The Sophistical Refutations, he described the fallaciousness of putting the questioner, but not the argument itself, under scrutiny. What he called ambiguous arguments gestured at a person, but those ideas would later go on to be refined by Galileo and John Locke. And yeah, that Galileo, the one who was attributed to coming up with the scientific method and a list of other accolades, he dabbled in this too amongst his work mapping the stars, trying to stop bad arguments from entering scientific debate. By the 20th century, it had become looped into a category of logical fallacy to encompass the wide range of ways a person can try to skirt a topic or try to dominate the situation by using a person's identity, some of which you're probably familiar with seeing in political disagreements online, but maybe even in your relationships. So let's go over these forms of the ad hominem. The abusive ad hominem attack. The first and most obvious is the basic abusive ad hominem, also known as verbal abuse. This means that someone is pointing out a characteristic or a trait or a behavior that's attributed to you, and then using that as a reason to not consider the previous point that you made. Among the easiest to spot because the topic derails very quickly, and you're having to talk about you instead of the issue at hand. It's almost the most unproductive line of reasoning. It shows that the person using it doesn't have any respect for you or the situation. Not all that long ago, I was arguing about greed with a Bay Area elite liberal who thinks that greed is a good life strategy and is a professional investor. Bob the accountant, whom I've mentioned in previous content because in the last 9 months that I had to talk to him, almost every other day was a debate with his ego, making my existence with him the sort of cautionary tale worthy of the 90s TV trope name to fit the mediocre existence of a man whose only program purpose was making money. I wasn't even the one who brought up the words inherent greed, as if that's a real diagnosable genetic condition. He was the one who started this discussion about the figment of his imagination, a cognitive bias, one which he borrowed to justify his own wealth accumulation, no matter at what cost it might have had to other people. This was based on the idea that all humans are greedy. This made him just another fighter in the ring. I rejected his claim that it was real and proceeded to talk about the etymology of the word greed, followed by sending studies on the real potential for life success being exploitative financially, and a survey on whether or not people thought greed was good, reporting that less than half of the population agreed with him. I suspect that tilted his fragile, wealthy emotions because the next texts I received, I was being called fixated to dissuade me from talking any further about the subject of monetary gain. Critiquing my personality or behaviors is a subtle way to show disapproval, to shake my confidence. And there was the con, because why change the topic? The subtle attack for most, but it looks a lot worse when you know that I'm neurodivergent and frequently chastised with the word fixated and obsessed to describe behavior associated with my disability. As a byproduct, he ends up being ableist by trying to shut me down with pointers on how I can be more socially acceptable as a person. Like, I don't get that from concerned ableists all the time. The irrational move to attack my identity rather than continue arguing about greed showed that perhaps he has a disdain for people who don't act or behave within his ideas of socially acceptable. He can correlate it to which of my statuses that he fears the most, as others will correlate your statuses as the reason that you can't be trusted or listened to. Don't let them get you down. They just want control of the situation. For some, your identity as a woman may disqualify you from ever being taken seriously if they believe in biological essentialism of your gender. They may insist that you don't have the rational capabilities to think critically, thereby undermining your point because you're too emotional to have one. Oh, the irony in their irrational debate tactic to move away from the original topic. Who's actually the emotional one here? You can see this format deployed at many identities, very commonly people of color whom racists fear due to their belief in essentialism. If they knew people weren't actually different, why be nervous? This tactic is even used by parents against their own children. For example, if my mother wanted control of my behavior, she would speculate that I had a mental illness rather than deal with any valid point that I made to her. An example of how parents are the first to train cognitive biases and logical fallacies into their kids. It's the first authoritative figure that is dishonest, leading to a life of normalizing dishonest and exploitative behavior out of trusting that their parents were good people. You've likely seen the name-calling in comment threads online or by politicians on TV, or the outright accusations made of others' motives with no evidence, but never talking about the real problem. Just distract, distract, distract. Well, because that's the whole game. The QuoQue fallacy. Probably the most common one I hear get deployed is the hypocrisy argument or the QuoQue fallacy. In one in which you're trying to hold someone accountable for the thing that they've done, and suddenly you're talking about something that happened months ago or even years ago that was similar to the thing that you're explaining to them now, as if you doing it months ago erases a problem with them doing it now. Essentially, the manipulator's game is to use you or someone else's history against them. They need to get the attention off themselves and get it onto you. This trap is specifically meant to catch you in your own mistakes. That's the con. Don't take your eye off the ball here. You could still be entirely correct about what you're criticizing them for, and you would know if you learned from your previous mistake, the one that they're trying to use against you right now. It's easy enough to say to them, yeah, and it was wrong when I did it too. Hypocrisy can only fool you if you haven't learned lessons from your past and you keep complaining about everybody else doing it. Don't let your history catch up to you in an argument. Be ready to admit when your own actions weren't defensible. The other format that you'll frequently see deployed is the classic whataboutism. This trick deflects criticism by responding to an accusation with a counter-accusation. Like a person accused of lying might respond, well, what about you? You lie all the time. Well, if you complain about a Republican politician, then you're likely to hear something about a Democrat next in the world of reactionary politics, where it's all about perspective and derailing, but never about getting down to facts or writing any legislation. It's a pointless pendulum swing of left to right politics within a system designed for only two groups, the rich and the poor. Everything else is just a distraction. History doesn't really erase today's consequences. I don't care which side of the political spectrum that we sit on. Can we all just at least agree that whataboutism is a waste of time? Circumstantial ad hominem. Well, yet another format where ad hominems can be seen is the circumstantial ad hominem, where someone attempts to point to a person's circumstances as being suspicious of bias, as if a person's identity makes them incapable of being rational or logical due to that position. Now, you can wonder if this is a psychological projection from the person who's making the accusation, because they seem to be struggling with reasoning errors if they think that someone's job, affiliation, race, gender, social class, sexual orientation, or cultural background impacts the person's intelligence or rationale. Their logical fallacy overlaps with eugenics. That's the con. A person might want to be embarrassed for using it, because that's some grade A bullshit. That's entirely revealing of an idea set that someone has to make such a point as if that had validity. They just gave away their beliefs about genetics that could be easily flipped to put them on the back foot for espousing the ideology of a supremacist. If they want to derail on your identity, ask them if they support genocide for the inherently biased. And it's about to get real uncomfortable real quick. An irrational point opens up the opportunity for some very funny moments if you're willing to use them. Sometimes you can't crack a joke because the abuser that you face might kill you for it. But you know, when you're dealing with anti-intellectualism, it trips on irony like a rake to the face. My favorite one of these has to be when I criticize rich people for being unhealthy with greed. People tell me that I'm jealous because I'm poor. It wouldn't have anything to do with rich people being 10% of the population doing 49% of the consumer spending. No, you can never have a valid point against the rich or their disruption of economics. You can't be anything but blindly emotionally jealous, apparently, says the classist eugenicist who fell for a belief in meritocracy. Why do you think people say that so that they can distract you from income inequality? Guilt by association. Well, perhaps you've even heard this one too. Guilt by association, whereby any connection or friendship that you have can suddenly invalidate an argument. It's weird, isn't it? Does anyone remember Obama being called a terrorist? It's probably difficult after all this decade of hearing much more outlandish claims to even remember where this all got started, but it was way back in 2008. Sarah Palin made the initial claim by citing Obama's ties to Bill Ayers, the leader of the Weather Underground Group, a Marxist-Leninist organization responsible for 25 political bombing incidents from 1969 to 1977. It didn't matter that Obama had denounced any political violence or terrorism. That loose association was enough to get people chanting and convinced that Obama was a radical left threat to the country and its conservative infrastructure at the time. That's the con. We all know neoliberalism didn't change in the Obama era. They really had nothing to worry about except for some advancement in civil rights, but fear sells, and the United States, with its Red Scare propaganda, is a hot item. If you can associate not just guilt, but fear, you can use emotions to persuade a voter. Tone policing. The last one to touch on for today's topic is a sneaky, subtle, and overused tool of behavioral control called tone fallacy. In this situation, after you've delivered a point, they will derail the conversation to start talking all about your behavior, your delivery, your tone, or whatever else you supposedly haven't done according to their personal standard. Their clever tactic here is to make themselves into the victim. That's the con. They don't want to argue with your valid points, facts, or criticism. This is a diversion to escape the conversation by criticizing you for whatever they think that they can get you to fall for. Perhaps they use your kindness against you and complain that you're not nice enough. Perhaps they use humility and say that you're being pretentious or condescending. These are accusations to see if you'll cave and coddle their feelings like they're a toddler. In pop culture, this move took on its own terminology deemed tone policing, given that this was almost always used as a rhetorical device on women talking specifically about feminism, making tone policing a tactic of reactionaries who push back on ideas or even having conversations about sexism. If that man doesn't want to hear it, he uses his position of privilege to tell her how to think or act. And Hilariously enough, it points out the problem with the man that's already being told about his sexism issues, confirming that he is indeed the sexist that he's being accused of. He will prove it by tone policing, feeling that his needs and his feelings are more important than what a woman has to say or her civil rights. Being a fixture of the Bullshit and Biases series, there is Bob the Accountant's story for this one too, because he's such a smug elitist that he trips on making himself look irrational and stupid regularly because he just has to be right. He doesn't care about being fair, proving that he's nothing more than a manipulative man that you wouldn't want to date. Because of that, I'm saving this story for a podcast on red flags that you can spot during your dates. Consider subscribing for free to stay updated on more content like this. Identity politics and culture wars. And while this is just one segment of logical fallacies, other rules out there can help you spot manipulations in your day-to-day life. And I'll be writing more about them through this series about debate being a con game. But I also write pieces about the cultural impacts that influence us and the ways in which we develop these biases through how we were taught to think. One cognitive bias here or there isn't a sign of a concern, but a pattern of them that frequently makes excuses for the self perhaps is diagnostic criteria for a mental illness. Cognitive biases are miscalculated conclusions based on what experience or information a person has. Their analysis leads to an inaccurate and irrational answer. Bias. This information is stored in the brain to be triggered at any time or even generate emotions attached to the bias. So, for example, let's say someone has some negative experiences with black people and now they cry that black people are dangerous and we shouldn't want to be around them. You've probably heard a couple of these, like the Dilbert creator Scott Adams, who blew up in controversy in 2023 for his racist tirade on social media, telling white people to get the hell away from blacks. They have come to a false conclusion that associating a person's darker skin tone can tell you if you're going to have a negative experience. Irrational fear is the basis of all hate. Here on Substack, I read a 10-page article by a man attempting to justify why black people aren't safe while trying to use statistics and crime cases as evidence. Just think about that for a moment. 10 pages of inaccurate conclusions this person wrote out because they won't acknowledge that they are the problem. They won't acknowledge their emotions' role at all in their behavior or avoidance, even if emotions are the only thing that would explain it. Does that seem sane to you? Crafting pages of items that you assume are rational points, but none of them are? Racist might make you scratch your head at how this happens. It's from a belief in free will, identity, and the ability to be inferior, which you can guess that the racist already thinks they are. That's why they have to overcompensate by talking about how bad black people are. Cognitive bias is only possible from one idea that makes all other ideas possible: free will. Part of critical thinking is confining and restraining our thinking processes with discipline, the discipline of logic, to make sure that we're getting to conclusions that make rational, logical sense. It sounds kind of awful at first. It sounds like I'm talking about mental imprisonment, but the odd and paradoxical thing about critical thinking, it will set you free from bias and now able to make decisions without having influence and emotions make them for you. We can't just believe whatever we want. If there's measurable science to govern the outcomes of our decisions, we can't force the outcome, only play the odds of probability. Free will tricks you into thinking anything is possible, even if it wasn't. So consider the self-destructive consequences of free will. Because it can also trick you into thinking that someone else had a choice, even when they didn't. You think that they might have had free will to choose a better result, but you couldn't see the restrictions that forced them into the life that they're in. It's called correspondence bias, where you put a little too much emphasis on the internal states or abilities or choices of a person, not their external conditions, and in doing so, miscalculate an unfair judgment aimed at a person's identity. If a black person is poor, well, maybe it's just bad luck, not that they're dangerous or anything. All these fallacies come from cultural ideas about human behavior that can't be proven. It makes attacking someone's identity easy, more difficult to look at a circumstance beyond a person's control. Under neoliberal identity politics and Reaganomics, meritocracy would define the modern America by ripping away social safety nets, letting millions fall into poverty over the coming decades, only to be shamed for the inequality created by policies that advantage the already wealthiest in society. If you couldn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps into the middle class, you were just too lazy to do it. Failure under capitalism was individualized into everyone's identities through classism. The market is always fair, so it must be you who's not good enough. And if black people are still poor, then it must be that they're not good enough genetically, so let's find some reasons that they're not that we think sound plausible. No, really, that's how it's being done. It's the foundation of the concept known as eugenics. How will you make an irrational fear somehow rational? You can't. Because let's say there's a black person who irrationally fears white people after years of negative experience with racists. They might now act in a similar way to the white racist, looking for examples of harm to pin on white people as if it's genetically or culturally coded into someone who looks white, as if white people cannot stop ourselves from being biased or unfair, and all the same rules would apply here too. We cannot predict behavior by skin color, not even by culture either. The human consciousness that operates behavior and runs on electrical current is not determined by genetics and culture alone, but by thousands of influences individualized to the person, making it useless to attempt to categorize people by social groups. And when people try, bias and discrimination happens. Given that people do experience bias in a society to such alarming consequences, if we look at it with empathy, we see that they're just scared of bad experiences too. But being scared isn't an excuse to be unfair or rude, because now we're just creating the bad experience for someone else with our irrational fears, and the cycle continues. We have to be brave enough to stop. All of us. Identity does not explain everything, it explains almost nothing but how discrimination is created. It's good to consider the 30,000-foot view of our society at the time, how cruel economic policies and cynically styled television have shaped everyone's thinking far more than we realize, that we didn't just come out to our individual conclusions about the world because what we saw on TV was all true, but we started to believe that the world we saw on TV was real. A harsh world of the haves and have-nots, all explained by identities through stories that we remember. From the introduction of Talk to Each Other like it's 1995, mapping nostalgia in the 1990s in contemporary media culture. The so-called War on Terror, which began in 2001, and the decade of ideologically driven austerity that followed the global financial crisis of 2008, clearly underpin this period. Though placed in a wider time frame, the current discontents can be seen as inevitable consequences of a larger structural collapse. Rampant neoliberalism has led to decades of stagnant wages, historic levels of state and personal debt, and a contemporary labor market defined by temporary, precarious jobs that undermine possibilities of long-term life planning. It has also forged the conditions for the rise of populism and authoritarianism. Assuming the work of analyzing media culture still has some value in the face of the apocalypse, it remains pertinent to inquire about the nature of the cultural response, especially since the age of catastrophe also happens to be the age of media saturation. We live through an era of mass media, the 24-hour news cycle, and the never-ending lineup of cynical sitcoms, which fed into a culture of despair and reconstruction. Quote, "It's TV's promulgation of cynicism about authority works to the general advantage of television on a number of levels. First, to the extent that TV can ridicule old-fashioned conventions right off the map. It can create an authority vacuum. And then, guess what fills it? The real authority on the world now that we view as constructed and not depicted becomes the medium that constructs our worldview. Second, to the extent that TV can refer exclusively to itself and debunk conventional standards as hollow, it's invulnerable to critics' charges that what's on is shallow or crass or bad, since such judgments appeal to conventional, extra-televisual standards about depth, taste, and quality. 2. The ironic tone of TV's self-reference means that no one can accuse TV of trying to put anything over anybody. As S.A. Lewis Height points out, self-mocking irony is always sincerity with a motive. David Foster Wallace. This set of observations stuck out to me over the years, seeing how our society morphed around the televised social norms, making us all into these little drones of cultural conglomerate. It didn't just advertise as products, it advertised an entire worldview that robbed authority from existing institutions and social norms of decency, all while being gleefully self-referential and criticizing itself for being silly and unserious, crass and shallow. It was permission to be nihilistic and accuse everybody of having a motive. To be unserious as the actors? And did we really choose this attitude of cynicism, irony, and cruelty, or was this manufactured consent? A topic for another post. Because that gets us closer to understanding how our advertising and media were shaped through history, why it was capable of mass propaganda through television and other media that followed corporate professionalism as a rulebook, which would ultimately start shaping the behavior around a common trend: narcissism. Neoliberalism is a new breed of an old slavery system. This one's just new and improved, using psychological manipulation to get you to overwork yourself for achievement and identity. You don't even have to crack the whip on your slaves anymore. They're automated. They'll drive themselves to death for the glory of work ethic. Who has a shelf full of self-help books using their identity to shame them into working harder? Well, trash them, don't donate them. No one else needs to suffer their mental disorders a person will find within their pages. The belief in neoliberal ideology alone can make you start to lose touch with the rational. The whole roadmap to neoliberalism is published in the book The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. He sold the idea that social democracy forming at the time of the 1950s was tyranny. It sounds like a conspiracy, but it's not. It's just Red Scare anti-communist propaganda that ironically manifested an ideology of mental illness. History was no different than it is today, with wealthy people able to determine what's in the news and thus determine what the population thinks is important by way of owning the means of distributing the media. CNBC is an entire channel dedicated to how important the stock market is. Is Wall Street always more important than genocides, wars, or a tornado that left hundreds of Americans homeless? Remember, important is subjective. So is what's news. It's not an evil plot to vilify marginalized people, it's just a plot to increase GDP with the unintended consequence of causing rising discrimination along with rising inequality. Because if capitalism isn't causing the problem, then who is? Well, we need you to hate yourself to work harder. Maybe that would explain why you hear so many people today using ad hominems like they were valid points. Identity now explains everything to individuals who bought the bullshit.